I still had dirt on my shoes from the cemetery when my daughter-in-law told me I needed to leave. Not asked, told. She didn't even wait until the guests had gone. My son's colleagues were still standing in the living room with their paper plates and their condolences, and Renee walked up to me in the kitchen, lowered her voice just enough so no one else could hear, and said, "I think it would be better if you made arrangements to stay somewhere else tonight. This is my home now, and I need space to process." I looked at her. I had known this woman for 6 years. I had sat beside her at my son's graduation from law school. I had held her hand in the hospital waiting room when she had a scare during her second trimester, the pregnancy that didn't make it. I had driven 4 hours in a snowstorm to help her paint the nursery for my grandson, who was then 3 years old, and upstairs in his room right now, probably wondering why there were so many strangers in his house and why his father wasn't coming home. I said, "Renee, I just buried my son today." She said, "I know, and I just lost my husband, so you understand why I need my space." What I understood was that she had rehearsed that line. My son James died 11 days before his 41st birthday. Aneurysm. That's what they told us. He went to sleep on a Tuesday night and didn't wake up on Wednesday morning. Renee called me at 6:15 and I was on the road by 6:40. I drove the whole 3 hours on autopilot, telling myself he was going to be fine, that hospitals make everything sound worse than it is, that James was healthy and strong and had his whole life in front of him. He was already gone when I got there. I won't describe that moment. Some things don't have words, and even if they did, I wouldn't spend them here. What I will say is that in the weeks that followed, I watched my daughter-in-law transform into someone I did not recognize. It happened slowly enough that I kept explaining it away. Grief does strange things to people. She's overwhelmed. She doesn't mean it. But the day she handed me a folded piece of paper with a local extended stay hotel's address written on it, the day after my son's funeral, I stopped making excuses. I took the paper. I picked up my overnight bag. I walked up the stairs and knocked on my grandson Marcus's door and told him I'd see him very soon, that I loved him, that his daddy loved him too. He was 4 years old and he had James's eyes, and I held it together just long enough to get back to my car. Then I sat in that driveway and I cried until I couldn't anymore. Now, there are things about me that Renee knew and things she did not. She knew I was a retired schoolteacher. She knew I lived alone in a 3-bedroom house in Decatur. She knew I drove a 10-year-old Buick and clipped coupons and brought Tupperware containers of food whenever I visited, because I didn't like to spend money at restaurants. She knew I was practical and quiet, and that I had spent 31 years teaching middle school English and that I did not make a fuss. What she did not know, what James had specifically asked me not to mention, because he said Renee was sensitive about money and he didn't want her to feel like she owed anyone anything, was that I owned the building where her law firm leased its office space. I want to be clear about how that happened, because it matters. When my husband Robert passed 15 years ago, he left me 2 things: a life insurance policy and a piece of advice. The advice was from his brother, who had spent 40 years in commercial real estate outside of Atlanta. He told Robert, and Robert told me, don't let the money sit. Find something solid. Find something that other people always need. Office space, it turned out, was something people always needed. I didn't do it alone. Robert's brother helped me. I took that insurance money and I was careful and I was slow and I asked every question twice and I made a lot of phone calls and eventually I bought a small commercial building in Midtown Atlanta, 2 floors, 8 units. Nothing glamorous. It was a 1970s building with updated wiring and good bones and a parking lot that needed resurfacing every few years. But it was mine, and it was paid off within 9 years, and the rent checks came in every month like clockwork. Renee's firm had been leasing Suite 4B for the last 4 years. James knew. He had thought it was funny, actually, his wife working in his mother's building without knowing it. He kept saying he was going to tell her, that he was waiting for the right moment. He never found it. After Renee asked me to leave, I drove to that hotel and I lay on top of the stiff bedspread and I stared at the ceiling and I thought about my son. I thought about the way he used to call me every Sunday morning, no matter what. I thought about how he'd read to Marcus from the same books I'd read to him, Anansi stories, Langston Hughes, anything with rhythm and heart. I thought about how he'd squeezed my hand at the funeral, and no, wait, that was years ago when Robert died. I had confused the memories. That's what grief does. It scrambles the timeline. I stayed in that hotel for 9 days. On the 10th day, my daughter-in-law's attorney called mine. That was the first sign that something had shifted. I had not hired an attorney, not yet. But my friend Paulette had insisted I speak with her nephew, who practiced family law, just to understand my rights regarding Marcus. I had called him mostly to make Paulette feel better. But he'd been thorough, and when I mentioned the building, he'd gone very quiet for a moment and then said, "Miss Elaine, I think we need to talk about a few things." His name was Darnell, and he was 29 years old and wore bow ties and spoke like he had twice his experience. He explained to me that, as Marcus's paternal grandmother, I had legal standing to petition for visitation. He also explained that James's estate, his life insurance, his 401k, the equity in the house, would go through probate, and that Renee, as his spouse, was the primary beneficiary. That part I had already accepted. What I had not thought about was the building. Darnell looked at me over the tops of his glasses and said, "You understand that your daughter-in-law's employer is your tenant." I said I understood that. He said, "And you understand what that means in terms of leverage?" I told him I didn't want leverage. I told him I wanted to see my grandson. He nodded and said, "Then let's start there." What happened next unfolded over about 6 weeks, and I want to tell it carefully because the details matter. Renee had, in those first weeks after James died, made a number of decisions quickly. She had retained an attorney of her own, a partner at a larger firm, not the one in my building, and she had made it quietly clear that she intended to limit my access to Marcus. Not eliminate it, she would say if anyone asked. Just structure it. Supervised visits. Scheduled in advance. Nothing spontaneous. Nothing that might confuse Marcus during a difficult transition. I had spent 31 years teaching 12-year-olds. I knew when someone was using careful language to do an unkind thing. But here is what I also knew. I had a lease agreement with Renee's firm that was coming up for renewal in 4 months. A 5-year lease. Their office held 12 attorneys and a support staff of 8. They had put considerable money into that suite. Custom millwork, a conference room renovation, a reception area that had been featured in one of those local business magazines. They were not going anywhere. I did not threaten anyone. I want to make that absolutely clear. I did not call the firm. I did not contact their managing partner. I did not use the building as a weapon. But Darnell sent a letter, a very measured and professional letter, to Renee's attorney, which outlined my interest in a formal visitation arrangement for Marcus, and noted in the 3rd paragraph that I was the owner of the commercial property where his client's employer maintained its primary offices. The letter said nothing improper. It simply established gently that I was not a woman without resources, that I had been patient and quiet, and that I had buried my son and been escorted from his home the same day, and that I was now formally requesting to be part of my grandson's life. I heard later from Paulette, who heard it from someone else in that way that information travels, that when Renee's attorney showed her that letter, she went pale. She had worked in that building for 4 years. She had ridden that elevator. She had complained once at Christmas dinner about how the building's management was slow to fix the HVAC, not knowing she was complaining to the woman who owned the building. I had made a note to call the property management company on Monday. I never mentioned it. Now she knew. The negotiation, if you could call it that, took 3 weeks. Renee's attorney and Darnell exchanged letters. There were 2 phone calls. At no point did Renee and I speak directly, which was her choice and which I respected, because I think we both knew that a direct conversation would either fix everything or break it beyond repair, and neither of us was ready to find out which. What we arrived at was this: I would have Marcus every other weekend, Friday through Sunday. I would have him for 2 weeks in the summer. I would be present at major holidays on a rotating basis. Renee retained final decision-making authority over his education and medical care, which was appropriate and which I did not contest. In exchange, when the lease came up for renewal, my property management company would offer her firm a 5-year renewal at the existing rate, with a cost of living adjustment capped at 3% annually, which was below market. I did not do that to buy access to my grandson. I did not do it as a transaction. I did it because James would have wanted things to be peaceful, and because Marcus deserved a life where the adults around him were not at war, and because I had enough years behind me to know that winning an argument and doing the right thing are not always the same thing. The first weekend I had Marcus, I picked him up on a Friday afternoon. He came down the front walk with his little backpack. It had a rocket ship on it. James had picked it out, and he said, "Grandma Elaine, did you bring the good snacks?" I had brought goldfish crackers and apple slices and the small containers of peanut butter he liked. I said, "Baby, I always bring the good snacks." He climbed into the back seat, and we drove to my house in Decatur, and we made pancakes for dinner, because he said pancakes were better at night, and I agreed with him completely. We watched a nature documentary about sea turtles, and he fell asleep before the credits, and I carried him to the guest room, and I stood in the doorway for a long time. There are people who will want me to say that Renee is a villain. I understand that. The story has the shape of a story where someone should be the villain, and she did things that were unkind and hasty, and, I believe, driven by fear and grief and a need to control something in a moment when everything felt out of control. I know that feeling. I have lived inside that feeling. But I also know that she is raising my grandson, and she is doing it alone, and James would have wanted me to give her grace. So I give her grace. I give it imperfectly, and sometimes through gritted teeth, and sometimes I have to go for a long drive afterward to let the feelings move through me. But I give it. Last spring, Marcus lost his first tooth. He called me on video chat to show me the gap, so proud of himself he could barely hold still. Renee was in the background, in the kitchen, and she looked up at the screen and she gave me a small nod. Not a smile, just a nod, an acknowledgement. I gave her one back. We are not friends. We may never be friends. But we are two women who loved the same man and who are both doing our best with what got left behind. James used to say when Marcus was still an infant and Renee was exhausted and they were both trying to figure out how to be parents, "We'll figure it out, Mom. We always do." I'm figuring it out, baby. I'm figuring it out, baby. Before I go, I want to ask you something. Where are you watching this story from today, and what time is it there? Drop it in the comments. And if this story moved you, if it reminded you of someone you love or something you've been through, I hope you'll share it. There's someone out there who needs to hear it tonight. I've had a lot of time to sit with what happened. That's one thing nobody tells you about getting older. You have more time to think, and the thoughts go deeper than they used to. When Renee handed me that hotel address, I don't think she saw a person. I think she saw an obstacle, a complication she hadn't planned for. And I understand, in a way I couldn't have understood at 40, that people in pain sometimes shrink the world down to just themselves. Not out of cruelty exactly, but out of a kind of desperation. She had lost her husband. She was terrified. And fear, when it doesn't know where to go, often goes sideways. But here's what I've come to believe, not because anyone told me, but because I've lived long enough to watch it play out over and over. The way you treat people in their most vulnerable moments says everything about who you actually are. Not who you think you are, not who you'd like to be, who you are. And the world eventually reflects that back to you. Not as punishment. I don't believe in some cosmic system of rewards and penalties doled out like report cards, but as consequence, as the natural result of the seeds you plant. Renee planted impatience and dismissal, And what grew back was a negotiation she had not anticipated, and a position far weaker than the one she thought she held. I planted 30 years of quiet work, careful decisions, one sensible investment at a time, and what grew back was the ability to walk into that situation with something solid behind me. Not a weapon, but a foundation. That's the thing about integrity. It doesn't announce itself. It just accumulates all those years of living within my means, of asking the right questions, of not spending money trying to look like I had more than I did. None of that felt like strategy at the time. It just felt like being responsible, like being the woman my mother raised me to be. But it added up to something real, and when the moment came that required something real, it was there. I think about James and what he would say if he could see how things turned out. He was a practical man, my son. He would probably point out that it all could have gone differently, that I got lucky in certain ways and he'd be right. But he also would have said, because he said it to me more than once, "Mom, you made your luck." And I think there's truth in that too. Not arrogance, just the recognition that preparation and patience and treating people decently over a long period of time tends to create conditions where things can go right, even when something has gone terribly wrong. Marcus is 5 now. Last weekend, he told me he wants to be a marine biologist because of the sea turtle documentary we watched together. I told him that was an excellent idea and that we'd need to visit the ocean so he could do his research. He thought about it very seriously and then said, "Grandma Elaine, can we bring the good snacks? Some things are worth everything it took to get here. If you take anything from my story, I hope it's this: live in a way that gives you something to stand on when the ground shifts. Not money necessarily, though that didn't hurt, but a reputation, a clear conscience, the knowledge that you did right by the people in your life, even when they didn't do right by you. That's not weakness. That's the longest game there is."